Welcome back, friends. Tonight you're stepping into the dark domain where reality blurs and the unexplainable waits in the shadows. We're diving into stories that will twist your perception and linger in your mind long after. So, grab a seat, turn off the lights, and if you haven't yet, hit subscribe to join us in the shadows. Let's begin. The Descent. I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about the quiet of nature, the way the world falls away, leaving just the crunch of dirt underfoot and the rustling of the wind in the trees. Solitude has its perks. No need to wait for anyone. No chatter to interrupt the rhythm of the trail. It's just you and the earth beneath your boots. That's how I found myself heading deep into the Appalachian Mountains last fall, looking for an adventure. I'd heard stories about a stretch of forest here that wasn't on any official trail maps, known only to the locals as the Descent. No one knew much about it except that it wasn't a path people used often. It didn't show up on satellite maps, and you couldn't find it on any GPS. That intrigued me. I'm drawn to places where the world feels untouched, where you can feel the weight of history pressing down from all sides. I started the hike early, before dawn. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and my boots crunched satisfyingly against the fallen leaves. As I ventured farther from the main trail, the trees grew denser and the sounds of the forest changed. Birds that had been singing seemed to go quiet, replaced by the steady drone of insects. The sunlight, once bright and clear, became muted as the canopy above thickened. I had a routine when I ventured off trail. Just like with every hike, I brought my pack full of supplies, but I also carried a small notebook. In it, I'd sketch rough maps of where I'd been, noting landmarks, distinctive trees, or unusual formations. I'd gotten lost enough times to know it's easy to get turned around in the woods, especially in places that don't follow the usual rules of nature. About 3 hours in, I came across something strange. A clearing, but not a natural one. The trees in this part of the forest were thick and gnarled, their roots twisting above ground like old, arthritic hands. But in this spot, the trees were evenly spaced, their trunks perfectly straight, almost unnaturally so. It was as if they'd been planted deliberately. The strangest part was the ground. The earth here wasn't the usual mix of soil and leaves. It was hard-packed dirt, almost like concrete, as if it had been walked on by countless feet over the years. There were no signs of human presence, no footprints, no litter, but the path was unmistakable. Curious, I started following the trail, my senses alert. As I moved deeper into the woods, I began noticing carvings on the trees. They were crude, but deliberate, marks made by someone or something with a purpose. At first, they seemed like simple scratches, but as I examined them more closely, I realized they formed symbols, strange and intricate designs that I couldn't place. They were old, the bark around them having grown back slightly, softening the edges, but not enough to erase them. My unease grew with each step. The forest was deathly quiet now, save for the occasional whisper of wind through the branches. Even the insects had fallen silent. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't a rational thought, but the sensation was overwhelming, like invisible eyes tracking my every move from behind the trees. That's when I noticed it. The rock formation. It stood ahead of me, towering and jagged, a dark silhouette against the trees. From a distance, it looked like any other boulder, but as I approached, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. Carved into the side of the rock was a face, not a crude, weathered face like you might find in ancient cave art, but a detailed, almost lifelike carving. The eyes were hollow, deep recesses that seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. The mouth was a gaping hole, jagged and wide, as if it were screaming. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the face. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath. I'm not a superstitious person, but standing there, in front of that rock, I felt something cold creep up my spine. A warning, maybe, or an invitation. I don't know why I did it, but I took a step closer, reaching out to touch the stone. The surface was cold and slick, far colder than it should have been. As my fingers grazed the carved face, I heard something, a sound so faint I almost didn't catch it. It was like a whisper carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the wind passing through the trees, but it was too deliberate, too human. I jerked my hand back, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced through 1,000 explanations, but none of them made sense. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a glint of orange in the underbrush. My breath hitched. I hadn't seen anyone else all day, but here, in this forgotten part of the forest, was a bright orange ribbon tied to a tree just off the path. I approached it cautiously. The ribbon was old, frayed at the edges as if it had been there for years, but more unsettling was the fact that it was tied in the exact same knot I used to mark my trails. I looked around, scanning the forest for any signs of life, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, waiting trees. I turned back to the rock, half expecting the carved face to have changed, to be watching me with those hollow eyes. But it was just stone, still and lifeless. The sound was gone too, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone else had been here before. Maybe they had used the same knot by chance. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. This place, it didn't follow the usual rules. And I had a sinking feeling I wasn't supposed to be here. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the trail behind me, looking for my own trail markers. But there were none. The stickers I'd placed earlier had vanished, every single one. My chest tightened, panic bubbling beneath the surface. I spun in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings, but everything looked the same. The trees, the underbrush, the endless stretch of forest, it all blended together, indistinguishable. I was lost. I tried to retrace my steps, moving quickly now, but no matter how far I walked, the landscape didn't change. It was as if the forest was rearranging itself, keeping me trapped. The whispering started again, faint at first, then louder. It wasn't the wind. It was voices, many voices, overlapping and growing more insistent. My pace quickened to a run, but the voices followed, echoing through the trees, urging me deeper into the forest. And then I saw it, another rock identical to the first, the same carved face, the same hollow eyes. I don't know how long I ran after that, hours maybe, but the forest never let me go. And now, sitting here, in the heart of this forsaken place, I wonder if I'll ever find my way out. The hidden path. There's something about the unmarked trails that always draws me in. Maybe it's the sense of adventure, or the challenge of navigating places few have ventured into. I've been hiking for years, and while most people stick to the well-trodden paths, I always prefer the ones that don't show up on any map. That's how I found myself in Dudleytown Forest, a place with a reputation so sinister, most locals avoid it at all costs. The forest is dense, a tangle of towering trees and thick underbrush, the kind of place that seems to have swallowed everything whole, including time itself. I wasn't worried, though. I had a system. I always carried a roll of bright orange stickers in my pack, leaving them on trees every few hundred feet as markers to guide my way back. It was simple, but it worked. At least, it always had. The day I ventured into Dudleytown started out like any other hike. The air was crisp, the sky a clear blue, and the forest was alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves. The deeper I went, though, the quieter it became. After a couple of miles, the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. Even the birds seemed to have vanished. I pressed on, my pace steady as I left a trail of stickers behind me. I didn't really believe in the ghost stories surrounding Dudleytown, but I couldn't deny there was something off about the place. The trees here seemed older, more twisted, their branches like gnarled hands reaching toward the sky. The air felt heavy, as if the forest itself was watching me. After an hour or so, I noticed something strange. There were carvings on the trees, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the bark. They weren't random scratches or natural formations. Someone had made these deliberately. The symbols varied in size, some small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, others stretching several feet across the trunks. I paused to examine one, running my fingers over the grooves. It was freshly carved, the edges still sharp. I told myself it was probably just the work of some bored hikers or maybe local kids trying to scare people. But the symbols didn't feel like a joke. They had an air of ancient intent, like they meant something important, something I couldn't quite grasp. I kept moving, though the unease settled in my gut like a stone. Every now and then I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, behind me. But there was nothing, just the trees and the thickening silence. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first they were faint, barely audible over the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I stopped, straining to listen. The sound stopped too. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for it to start again. After a minute of silence, I shook my head, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. But as soon as I started walking again, the footsteps returned, louder this time, more deliberate. They matched my pace, each step echoing mine like a shadow following just out of sight. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. I'd been in plenty of forests before, heard plenty of strange noises. There was no reason to panic. I focused on the trail ahead, on the orange stickers marking my way. As long as I had my markers, I knew I could find my way out. Except when I glanced at the next tree where I'd placed a sticker, it was gone. I frowned, scanning the area. Maybe I'd just missed it, or the wind had blown it off. But as I walked forward, I realized something far more unsettling. Several of the stickers were missing. Not just one or two, but all of them. My heart began to race as I checked the trees where I'd left my markers. Every single sticker had been removed. Someone had been following me. Someone had moved them. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Who would do that? Why? I thought about the strange carvings, the footsteps. The forest felt different now, darker, more oppressive. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches twisting toward me like skeletal fingers. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time they weren't behind me. They were ahead. My pulse quickened as I looked down the path. Through the trees I saw a flash of movement. Something or someone darting between the trunks. The footsteps grew louder, faster. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I turned and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted through the forest, dodging branches and leaping over fallen logs. I glanced back only once and saw a figure, a dark shape moving through the trees, too fast to be human. The footsteps were right behind me now, pounding the earth with an unnatural rhythm. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no idea where I was. Without my stickers, I had no way of retracing my steps. I was lost in the heart of Dudleytown, with something hunting me. I ran until my lungs screamed for air, until my legs felt like they would give out. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw it. A cave. The entrance was hidden behind a thicket of bushes, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the trees. Desperate, I veered toward it, ducking through the underbrush. The cave was dark, the entrance wide enough to swallow me whole. I hesitated for only a second before diving inside. The footsteps stopped abruptly at the entrance, and I pressed myself against the cold, damp wall, listening, waiting. Silence. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. Eventually, when I was sure the footsteps were gone, I crawled out of the cave. The forest was still, the air thick with tension. But the figure, whatever it had been, was gone. I didn't wait to find out if it would come back. I sprinted through the forest, no longer caring about my markers or the path. I just ran. Somehow, by sheer luck, I found my way back to the edge of the forest where my car was parked. I collapsed into the driver's seat, my body shaking, my clothes torn and dirty. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just the dark outline of Dudleytown Forest, fading into the distance. I never found out who or what moved those stickers. But one thing's for sure, I'm never going back to Dudleytown Forest. Some places are meant to stay forgotten. The hunt in Wasatch. It was late October and the air had that familiar crispness that only came with the changing of the seasons. I had planned this hiking trip for months. Just me, the mountains, and the peace I could only find in nature. The Wasatch National Forest in Utah was known for its remote trails, and that's exactly what I was after. I wanted to escape the world for a few days and reset. The first 2 days were uneventful, just as I had hoped. I set up camp each night, cooked simple meals, and let the sound of the wind through the trees lull me to sleep. On the third morning, I packed up early and decided to explore a new section of the trail. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, and the trail ahead seemed untouched, exactly the way I liked it. Around midday, I returned to the spot where I had left my car. As soon as I saw it, my stomach dropped. All 4 tires had been slashed, deep cuts rendering them completely useless. The car sat lopsided on its rims, and I felt that creeping sensation of being watched. My first thought was that maybe some mischievous kids had done this, but there was no sign of anyone around. The area was completely deserted, or so I thought. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no cell signal out here, not even a bar. It was 2009, and I didn't have the luxury of a smartphone or GPS to call for help. Instead, I carried an old flip phone, the kind you used for emergencies, if you were lucky enough to get service. A sudden snap of a branch from the tree line pulled me out of my thoughts. I glanced around, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. Maybe it was just an animal. But then I saw movement, a quick flash of something dark darting between the trees. My heart raced as I tried to shake off the growing unease. I told myself it was nothing. After all, I'd been hiking alone for years. I knew these woods. There was no reason to panic. But that feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the notion that someone, or something, was out there, following me. I started walking, trying to think rationally. The nearest ranger station was a good 3 miles up the trail. I could make it before nightfall if I kept a steady pace. But as I moved, I kept hearing sounds, rustling leaves, twigs snapping underfoot, too synchronized to be wildlife. It was as if they were mirroring my steps. After an hour of walking, I spotted something up ahead, a small clearing. Relief washed over me when I saw a dirt road cutting through the forest, leading up to a ranger's outpost. I picked up my pace, but as I reached the edge of the clearing, I froze. There were symbols carved into the trees surrounding the road. They weren't anything I recognized, but they gave off a strange, almost menacing vibe. The carvings were deep, as if whoever made them wanted to leave a permanent mark. I ran my fingers over the rough bark trying to make sense of it, but my gut told me to move. I didn't get far before I heard it, a soft, deliberate whistle from behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. The whistle came again, this time from my left and then my right. My pulse quickened. Someone was out there playing a game with me. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was it some local trying to scare me off their land? Or something more sinister? Panic set in. I took off running down the dirt road, my boots pounding against the ground. The whistling continued, growing louder and more erratic. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse. The ranger station came into view just as the last light of day started to fade. I sprinted to the door and banged on it, praying someone was inside. After what felt like an eternity, a ranger opened the door, a tall, grizzled man with a serious expression. I barely got the words out, explaining what had happened with my car and the strange whistling. He listened quietly, his face unreadable, then nodded slowly. "You're lucky you made it here," he said, his voice low. "We don't usually talk about it, but there are stories about groups living out in these woods, not the friendly kind." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. The ranger looked around as if checking for anyone listening. There have been reports over the years, hikers going missing, strange symbols carved into the trees like the ones you saw. We've found campsites, old fires, but no people. Most of the time nothing comes of it, but every once in a while someone gets too close to something they shouldn't. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do they want? The ranger shook his head. Don't know, and I don't plan on finding out. Best thing you can do is stick with me until morning. Then I'll get you out of here, safely. That night I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside the station had me on edge. I kept thinking about those symbols, the slashed tires, the whistling. I knew I'd been followed. I knew they were still out there. The next morning, the ranger drove me back to my car. We found the tires slashed, just as I'd left them. But there were no footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. The ranger helped me contact a tow truck, and by midday, I was on my way back to civilization. As we parted ways, the ranger gave me a final warning. You got lucky this time. Stay away from these woods. Some things out here don't want to be found. I never returned to the Wasatch National Forest after that. But sometimes late at night, I swear I still hear that faint, eerie whistle coming from just outside my window. The fast lane. I took a job as a truck driver a few years back, hauling supplies along the interstate highways stretching through Nevada. My route often took me down the lonely highways near Reno, with long stretches of barren desert on either side. It was usually quiet with barely any traffic, just me, my truck, and the road. One night I was driving a late shift, my rig cutting through the desert darkness with only the distant glow of Reno's city lights on the horizon. I was on a 2-lane highway with no cars around when I saw a vehicle flash its high beams behind me. I checked my mirrors. A white pickup truck was coming up fast. I moved to the side, expecting it to pass, but it stayed behind me, flashing its lights like it wanted me to pull over. It was odd. I wasn't speeding, and I hadn't seen any other cars for miles. Curious and slightly annoyed, I slowed down, letting it come alongside me. The truck's passenger window was rolled down, and I caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in his 30s looking frantic. He was shouting, waving his hand at me to stop. I couldn't hear him over the engine, but his expression made my skin crawl. It wasn't anger or road rage, it was fear. He sped ahead of me and pulled over, stopping on the side of the road. Against my better judgment, I decided to pull over too. Maybe he needed help, though I wasn't keen on stepping out in the middle of nowhere. I parked a few yards behind him and rolled down my window. The man jumped out of his truck and ran toward me, looking around as if someone were after him. "You need to go back," he yelled, his voice breaking. "You don't know what's out here." I frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Turn around and get off this road," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "There's something that follows anyone who drives this stretch at night." I'd heard plenty of trucker legends, but this guy looked dead serious. Before I could say anything, he backed away, his face pale. "Just don't stop no matter what," he whispered, then bolted back to his truck, tires screeching as he sped off into the night. I sat there for a moment, the silence pressing in. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but another part, a deeper instinct, felt uneasy. The desert around me seemed darker, the air heavier. With a shiver, I decided it was best not to linger. I got back on the road, keeping my eyes on the stretch ahead. Not long after, I noticed my radio had gone to static. I fiddled with the dial, but it was like every station had been wiped clean. Then my headlights dimmed, flickering just enough to make me grip the wheel a little tighter. That's when I saw something up ahead, a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road. I braked hard, my tires screeching as I tried to slow down without swerving. As I came to a stop, the figure vanished, like it had never been there at all. I was rattled, but I forced myself to keep going, telling myself it was a trick of the light, maybe exhaustion. I checked the clock. It was only a little past midnight, and I still had hours of driving left. I pressed on, determined to shake off the strange encounter. But after a few miles, I saw it again, this time closer. A tall, dark shape in the middle of the road, just standing there like it was waiting for me. I couldn't make out any features, just a silhouette against the darkness. I didn't stop. I gritted my teeth and kept driving, swerving slightly to avoid it. As I passed, I felt a chill run through me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The figure appeared again, just a few miles down the road. No matter how far I drove, it was always there, waiting. Each time I tried to ignore it, but the encounters left me feeling more and more unsettled. I realized this was what the man in the truck had been talking about. At this point, I was driving well over the speed limit, desperate to reach the city lights up ahead. But then my truck began to sputter, the engine straining like it was being held back. My foot pressed down on the gas pedal, but my speed kept dropping. Panic gripped me as I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing directly behind my truck. But the road was empty, silent. Then, in the faint glow of my taillights, I saw it. A shadow darting along the side of the road, keeping pace with me. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence, dark and cold, pressing in around me. Just when I thought my truck would stall out completely, I reached a populated stretch with gas stations and convenience stores lining the road. The lights were bright and reassuring, and as soon as I crossed into the city, my truck roared back to life, the engine purring as if nothing had happened. I pulled into a truck stop, breathing heavily, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't want to stay long. I was afraid of whatever I'd left behind on that road. But as I climbed out to stretch my legs, I noticed another driver watching me. A tall man in a denim jacket, his face lined with exhaustion. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his tone grim. I didn't answer, but my expression must have been enough. He nodded. "It's been haunting that stretch of road for years. No one knows what it is, but it only appears at night, only to those driving alone." He paused, glancing toward the highway. "Once it's seen you, it's hard to shake. You'll feel it following you every time you pass that stretch." I left Reno that night, sticking to the main highways, taking the longest route possible to avoid that cursed road. But even now, I feel its presence whenever I drive at night. That shadow lurking just out of sight, waiting. The man with no shadow. I'd been working as a night security guard at an office building in downtown Portland for a few months. It was an easy job for a decent paycheck, and most nights were uneventful. The building was old, with creaky floors, dim hallways, and a slightly musty smell that you got used to after a while. I'd come to know every corner and stairwell by heart. The place was almost calming in its silence. One night, things changed. It was just after midnight when I saw him. The building was empty except for me, yet, as I was making my rounds on the third floor, I spotted a man at the end of the hallway, standing perfectly still. He was wearing a dark coat, hands tucked into his pockets, head slightly tilted as if he were listening for something. "Excuse me, sir, the building is closed," I called out, my voice echoing down the long hallway. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I told myself he was probably just a lost tenant or someone who'd wandered in. I took a few steps forward, calling out again, but he turned and began walking toward the stairwell, his steps slow and deliberate. I followed, but as I reached the end of the hall, he'd already disappeared around the corner. When I rounded the corner, he was gone. I scanned the stairwell, listening for footsteps, but there was only silence. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined him. It didn't make sense how he disappeared so quickly. Later, as I reviewed the security footage, I saw him again. The camera caught a clear shot of him entering the hallway. Tall, dark coat, head slightly tilted. But something was wrong. He didn't have a shadow. I watched as he walked down the hallway, his form clear and sharp. But there was no shadow trailing behind him, no sign that he was even connected to the floor. I rewound the footage, checked for glitches, but it was all there. Every detail, except his shadow. My skin prickled as I watched him disappear around the corner, the screen flickering slightly as he left the frame. Over the next few nights, I kept an eye out, half expecting to see him again. And every time I was alone in those dim hallways, I could feel his presence, like he was just out of sight, watching. Even though I hadn't seen him again in person, I felt on edge every time I reached the third floor. The hallways felt colder, like there was a draft, even though the rest of the building was always warm at night. Then about a week later, one of the other guards mentioned seeing the shadowless man on the security feed. He was trying to laugh it off, calling it a glitch in the camera, but I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. "What did he look like?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my palms were sweating. "Tall, wearing a coat, kind of off," he said, looking away. "No shadow, though. The guy just appeared like he came out of nowhere." I nodded, feeling a pit form in my stomach. "Yeah, I saw him too." The other guard looked at me, his face paling. "You think he's a trespasser? Or someone who's maybe living in the building?" I didn't answer. Deep down, I had a gnawing feeling that he was something else. Something I couldn't quite explain. But I avoided the third floor as much as I could after that, sticking to my rounds on the lower levels, though I still felt him, his silent presence lurking. One night, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to head up to the third floor, determined to confront whatever haunted this place. I told myself that if I could just see him up close, it would explain everything. Maybe he was just a person who didn't cast shadows for some reason, or a tenant who somehow knew how to avoid the cameras. But in the back of my mind, I knew I didn't believe any of that. The floor was dark and quiet, every sound amplified by the silence. I made my way down the hallway, my flashlight casting long shadows along the walls. And that's when I saw him again at the far end, standing exactly where I'd seen him the first night. This time I didn't call out. I just stared, feeling a chill crawl up my spine as I noticed again that he had no shadow. He turned slowly, and for the first time, he looked right at me. His eyes were dark, expression unreadable, and he began to walk toward me, each step silent as though he floated rather than walked. I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot as he came closer. And then, just as he was a few feet away, he stopped. I looked down, and there it was, my shadow, stretching out before me. But his figure stood there, completely detached from the light, as if it refused to acknowledge him. It was like he was existing outside of reality, a blank spot that no light could touch. Without another thought, I turned and bolted down the stairwell, my heart racing. When I reached the lobby, I gasped for air, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was a trick of the light, but I knew better. The memory of his shadowless figure was burned into my mind. I went back to the security footage the next morning, hoping I'd find some proof, something to explain it all. But when I replayed the footage, it was blank. The entire night's recording was gone, as if the cameras had shut off the moment he appeared. I checked the other feeds, but it was the same. The footage from that night simply didn't exist. After that, I requested a transfer. I told my supervisor it was for personal reasons, that I needed a change, but deep down, I knew I was running away from something I couldn't explain. I never wanted to see that shadowless figure again, to feel that creeping dread that seemed to seep into the very air around him. In the weeks after I left, I started having dreams about the third floor. In the dreams, I would walk down the hallway, hearing footsteps behind me, feeling his gaze on the back of my neck. I would turn, but he was never there. Only a cold, empty hallway stretching out before me. And yet, I could always feel him, just out of sight, waiting for me to step back into his world. Even now, whenever I pass by the building, I can feel his presence, a lingering weight in the air. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I catch a glimpse of a shadowless figure in the corner of my eye, standing silently in a reflection, watching, waiting. The photos that see. As a photographer in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I'm always looking for the unusual, the hidden stories that most people overlook. I specialize in landscapes, capturing the haunting beauty of the desert and old adobe buildings. But last spring, I found myself drawn into a nightmare that still follows me, one photo at a time. It started innocently enough. An older man named Luis approached me after seeing my work displayed in a local gallery. He had the quiet intensity of someone who knew the world held secrets. Luis wanted me to photograph his house, though he didn't say why, only that he needed someone with an eye for the unusual. Intrigued, I accepted the job, thinking it would be an easy paycheck and maybe a chance to add some unique images to my portfolio. When I arrived at Luis's house, it was more unsettling than I expected. The place was tucked away on the edge of town, an old adobe structure that looked more like a relic than a home. Cracks lined the walls, vines climbed the faded paint, and the windows were caked in a layer of dust so thick I could barely see through them. When Luis opened the door, he looked almost relieved to see me, though there was a hint of something else. Fear. "Just take the pictures," he said quietly, motioning toward the rooms. "I'll be in the other room if you need me." The house was filled with oddities, old relics, faded photographs, and strange trinkets that seemed out of place in an otherwise ordinary home. As I snapped shots of each room, I felt a growing sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me from just beyond the camera's view. I finished the shoot quickly, the strange atmosphere making me eager to leave. As I packed up, I glanced back to see Luis watching me from the hallway, his face tight with a look I couldn't quite place. I asked if there was anything specific he wanted in the photos, but he just shook his head and closed his eyes, as if he were already regretting calling me. That night, I went home and started developing the photos in my darkroom. The first few images were normal, just empty rooms with muted light filtering through the dusty windows. But then, as more photos developed, I noticed something strange. Faint shadows in the corners, almost like figures hiding along the edges of the frames. At first, I assumed it was a trick of the light or dust on the lens. But the more I examined the photos, the more it looked like faces. Their expressions were twisted in anguish, their eyes wide and desperate. It made no sense. I hadn't seen anything while I was there, and nothing in the house would explain such images. Convinced it was an error, I decided to return to Luis's house to retake the photos, hoping to clear things up. The next day I called Luis, who was hesitant but agreed to let me come back, though he warned me not to get too close. I arrived at his house again, this time in the early afternoon when the light was stronger. I examined each room carefully, checking for anything that might create strange shadows, but everything looked normal. The walls were bare, the windows empty. With Luis watching from the hallway, I took each shot meticulously, making sure nothing strange could get into the frame. That night, as I developed the new photos, my heart sank. The faces were still there, clearer than before, and unmistakably human. Their eyes seemed to follow me, filled with a desperate, pleading expression. Some were pressed against the windows, others were just faint shadows along the walls, and a few appeared to be reaching out, hands visible through the haze. I called Luis immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd seen. There was a long silence before he finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "They've found me," he whispered. Luis's words sent a chill through me. He explained that he'd once been involved in something he deeply regretted, something that left him haunted by lost souls. He wouldn't say more, only that he believed these souls had become bound to his house, lingering in the shadows, searching for a way out. Desperate to understand what was happening, I returned to his house the next day. Luis seemed even more on edge, his face gaunt, as though he hadn't slept in days. He showed me a room I hadn't seen before, a small, cramped space lined with old photographs, each one marked with strange symbols. He explained that these were people he had once known, people who had disappeared over the years. "It's like they're trapped here," he said, his voice trembling. "Like they can't move on." I spent hours talking with him, piecing together fragments of his story, though it made little sense. He spoke of rituals, lost memories, and shadows that moved on their own. He claimed he'd once tried to help these souls, but something had gone wrong, binding them to the house instead of setting them free. Before I left, I asked him why he'd called me to take the photos. His eyes darkened and he looked away. "I thought maybe if someone else saw them, they could be freed. That night, I sat alone in my dark room going over every photo, hoping to find something that could explain what was happening. As I looked closer, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Luis's face, faint and shadowed in the corner of one of the photos. His expression was one of horror, his mouth open in a silent scream, as though he were trapped within the image itself. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I tried to call him, but there was no answer. The following morning, I went back to his house, only to find it empty. The rooms were barren, stripped of everything, as though no one had lived there in years. Confused, I spoke to the neighbors, who claimed they hadn't seen anyone at the house for months. One elderly woman looked at me with pity, saying, "That place has been empty for years. It's been like that since old Luis vanished. Oh, must be over a decade now." A decade? My head spun as I tried to make sense of it. I had just spoken to him, been in his house, taken photos of his belongings. But the neighbors insisted, saying he'd disappeared without a trace, leaving only rumors and a haunted house in his wake. I returned to my studio, determined to find proof that he'd been there, that I hadn't imagined everything. But as I went through the photos, they began to change. The faces grew clearer, more distinct, each one twisted in fear. And among them, I saw Luis, his face becoming fainter with each photo, like he was slipping away, becoming one of the shadows. I deleted the photos from my camera, but they kept appearing, on my phone, on my computer, even printed and slipped under my door. Each time I deleted one, two more would show up, the faces clearer, their eyes more desperate. And every night as I lie awake in bed, I hear a faint whisper in the darkness. "Help us before it's too late." I don't know how to stop it, or if it can even be stopped. But every time I close my eyes, I see those faces twisted in agony, watching, waiting, their silent pleas growing louder, filling my mind with shadows and whispers. And in every photo, Luis's face fades a little more, slipping deeper into the darkness, becoming one of them, trapped, as if his last hope lies with me, in a photograph that never should have been taken. The haunting within. It was 3 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. That moment when I knew something was seriously wrong with me. I had been feeling off for days, nothing too alarming at first. Headaches, confusion, that sort of thing. It wasn't until the hallucinations began that I realized I might be in real danger. It started with a headache so intense I couldn't get out of bed. My husband, Mark, had already left for work, and I was alone in the house, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, hoping it would pass. The throbbing pain in my skull was unbearable, but I was too exhausted to even get up and take something for it. That's when I heard it. A small, soft voice. It said one word, barely a whisper. "Mom?" I shot up in bed, my heart racing. The voice had come from downstairs, but the problem was, we didn't have any kids. I tried to reason with myself, blaming the fever and the nausea. I was probably imagining things. Still, the sound of that voice chilled me to the core. I sat there for a minute listening, waiting for the voice to speak again. But there was nothing, only silence. I felt ridiculous for being so shaken up, but there was something about the voice. It sounded so real. Gathering what little energy I had, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, immediately regretting it as a wave of dizziness washed over me. I had to grip the bedpost just to stay upright. Slowly, I made my way to the top of the stairs. I didn't know what I expected to find down there. A child? Someone else in the house? I called out Mark's name, even though I knew he was at work. When I got no answer, I turned and went back to bed, telling myself I was being ridiculous. That should have been the end of it. But as I lay back down, a second voice called out, this time louder. "Hello?" It came from the same direction, downstairs, but this voice wasn't a child's. It was clearer, more distinct, almost like it was trying to get my attention. I felt a shiver creep down my spine. I was home alone. No one else should have been there. I was too weak to go downstairs again, and a part of me didn't want to. What was I going to find? Instead, I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and dialed Mark's number. He picked up after 2 rings, and I immediately blurted out what had happened, my voice shaky with fear. "There's someone in the house," I said. "I'm hearing voices, Mark. They're calling out to me." He tried to calm me down, telling me it was probably just a fever, that maybe I was hallucinating. I wanted to believe him, but the voices had felt so real. Mark promised he would come home early to take me to the hospital, but in the meantime, I needed to rest. As soon as I hung up, I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting violently into the toilet. My head felt like it was going to explode, and the dizziness was worse than ever. I could barely see straight. That's when I heard it again. A voice, only this time, it was right outside the bathroom door. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but I knew someone was there. I froze, my mind racing. The voice was soft, almost muffled, like someone whispering. But it was close, too close. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closing up. I slowly turned my head toward the bathroom door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The door was still shut, and I was alone. Or was I? By the time Mark arrived, I was curled up in bed, sweating profusely and shaking. The voices had stopped, but the fear hadn't. I could still feel that someone, or something, had been in the house with me. Mark rushed me to the hospital, where I was immediately admitted. It didn't take long for the doctors to diagnose me with bacterial meningitis. They told me that I was lucky to have gotten there in time, because if I had waited any longer, the outcome could have been far worse. As it was, I'd have to stay for several days, possibly even a week, depending on how my body responded to treatment. As they hooked me up to an IV for antibiotics, I asked the doctor about the hallucinations. He assured me that it wasn't uncommon for patients with severe infections like mine to experience vivid, sometimes terrifying hallucinations, especially when the brain is under such intense strain. That explanation made sense at the time, but it didn't stop me from feeling like there was more to it than just an infection. That night, after Mark left to go home, I drifted off to sleep almost immediately, but my dreams were far from peaceful. I found myself back in the house, only it wasn't empty this time. My ex-husband David was there, sitting by my bed, watching me. His expression was cold, calculating. He reached out, patting my head in a way that made my skin crawl. "I'm glad you're okay," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I came as soon as I saw Mark leave." He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. "You know I could kill him, right? I despise him, always have." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. All I could do was lay there, frozen, as he continued to talk about how much he hated my husband, how he wanted to hurt him. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stood up, patted my head again, and left the room. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. But what shook me the most was the chair. It was pulled up right next to my hospital bed, as though someone had been sitting there just like in my dream. I didn't remember anyone sitting in that chair before I fell asleep, and no one had visited me after Mark left. The next morning, I told the nurse about my strange dream, trying to laugh it off as just a side effect of the illness. But her response sent a chill down my spine. "That wasn't a dream," she said, her expression serious. "Your cousin came to visit you late last night." My stomach dropped. I didn't have any cousins, at least none that lived nearby. When I pressed her for more details, she said his name was David. I felt my blood run cold. David was my ex-husband. For the rest of my hospital stay, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I texted David, demanding to know why he had come to visit me and how he knew I was in the hospital. He denied everything, saying he had no idea what I was talking about. His text was calm, almost mocking. I never got a straight answer from him, and I never told Mark about the hallucinations or the threats. Even now, I wonder if it was all just a fever dream, or if there was something darker at play. All I know is, I'll never forget the voices, the whispers, or the chair sitting too close to my bed in the middle of the night. The nurse's shift. It was supposed to be just another night on the job. Emily had been working the night shift for almost 3 years at St. Vincent's Hospital, a facility in the middle of downtown. She had seen it all: emergency traumas, bizarre cases, and even the occasional overdose. But nothing ever unsettled her quite like the eerie, creeping quiet of the hospital at 3 a.m. That night was particularly quiet. Too quiet. Emily sat behind the nurse's station, scrolling through patient charts on her tablet. Her colleague, Joan, had just gone to take a quick nap in the break room. Emily didn't mind. She was used to being alone on these late shifts. Besides, they were well-staffed tonight, and most of the patients were either stable or sleeping. But something about the stillness felt off. The hospital felt colder than usual, and a strange hum seemed to reverberate through the walls. She thought about mentioning it to maintenance, but decided against it. It was probably just the old building settling. Hospitals were full of strange noises. As she reviewed the chart of a patient down in room 314, a long-term patient recovering from surgery, she noticed something strange. The name on the chart was unfamiliar. Emily was sure she had checked in on every patient earlier, but this name, David Carson, hadn't been there. Puzzled, she grabbed the master chart, flipping through the list of current patients. Room 314 was marked as empty. There wasn't supposed to be anyone in that room tonight. A knot of unease formed in her stomach. Maybe it was a clerical error. The hospital system wasn't the most reliable. But a sense of dread crawled up her spine. She felt the weight of the quiet pressing down on her, and that cold, buzzing sensation grew stronger. Against her better judgment, Emily decided to check the room. The hallways were dark and deserted. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead only added to the tension. As she neared room 314, her steps slowed. She half hoped she'd find the room empty, just like the chart said. She reached the door, hesitating before grasping the handle. A faint creaking noise echoed down the hall. She froze, her hand hovering above the door. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing closer. Emily's pulse quickened, and she turned to peer down the hallway. But it was empty. Shaking off the unease, she pushed open the door to room 314. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the smell of disinfectant. The bed was made, untouched. No sign of anyone having been there. But on the floor near the window, she noticed something that stopped her cold. A pair of muddy footprints. They led from the window to the foot of the bed, as though someone had climbed in from outside, but they stopped abruptly like the person who made them had just vanished. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This didn't make any sense. She quickly backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe some homeless person had found their way inside, though how they managed to get up to the 3rd floor was beyond her. She needed to tell Joan. As she made her way back to the nurse's station, Emily's hands began to shake. The dim lights overhead flickered again, casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. She was almost to the station when she heard it. The sound of labored breathing. It was coming from behind her. Emily turned, her breath catching in her throat. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. They were hunched over, their breathing ragged and deep, like they were struggling for air. "Sir?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its breath rattling louder and louder. Emily's instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The figure took a slow, shuffling step forward, and as it did, a faint light from a nearby window illuminated its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. No eyes, no mouth. Just nothing. Emily's scream caught in her throat as the figure took another step, its hands reaching out toward her, gnarled and twisted. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet in her panic. Desperate to escape, she turned and bolted toward the nurse's station. By the time she reached it, she could barely breathe, her chest tight with fear. She slammed the door to the station shut, locking it behind her. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared. But Emily could still hear that horrible breathing, faint and echoing down the hall. "Joan!" she gasped, pounding on the door to the break room. "Joan, wake up!" There was no response. The break room was dark. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking as she dialed security, but the line was dead. No dial tone, no sound at all. It was as if the entire hospital had fallen into some kind of eerie, suspended state. Emily's eyes darted around the station, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Her heart hammered in her chest. She wasn't imagining this. She couldn't be. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. In the reflection of a monitor screen, the figure stood behind her. Emily whipped around, but the room was empty. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, and that awful breathing sound returned, louder and closer. She backed into a corner, clutching a pair of scissors she had grabbed from the counter, her only defense against whatever was hunting her. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more and the breathing stopped. For several minutes, Emily stood frozen in place, her grip on the scissors tight, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the hospital had returned to its unsettling stillness. By the time Joan emerged from the break room, bleary-eyed and confused, the strange events had ceased. Emily could barely find the words to explain what she had seen. But when they checked room 314 together, the muddy footprints were gone, the floor pristine. There was no evidence of anything unusual at all. But Emily knew what she had seen. And even now, on her future shifts, she could still hear that faint, distant breathing. She knew it was only a matter of time before whatever it was returned. The haunting echoes of the hospital ward. I've worked in several hospitals over the years, but the geriatric facility I took a position at a few years back was by far the most unnerving. It wasn't something I noticed immediately, just small details at first, but my second-to-last shift there would be a night I'd never forget. It was the graveyard shift as usual. I was exhausted, running on hardly any sleep, but that wasn't new for me. The hospital was only about 30 minutes from my house, and I'd worked with elderly patients for years, so I was no stranger to the challenges. What was different this time, though, was the ward I'd been assigned to, the Alzheimer's unit. The patients in the Alzheimer's ward were quiet for the most part, often lost in their own worlds. They didn't communicate much, but they seemed to appreciate my presence. Maybe it was because I was younger, in my 20s, a fresh face in a place where time seemed to stand still for them. There was one patient, though, who stood out from the rest. Lena. Lena was more restless than the others. She would often call me into her room, claiming she heard voices. I didn't think much of it at first. Patients with dementia often experienced hallucinations. But what she described was unsettling. She kept talking about a man in black, standing in the corner of her room just watching her. Each time she mentioned him, her face would pale, her voice trembling. It wasn't just her fear that unnerved me. There was something about the way she described the man. His stillness, his silence, and the unnerving smile she claimed he wore. Every time I entered her room, I felt a chill in the air. But when I checked, there was no one there. On that particular night, Lena was more agitated than ever. She gripped my hand, her eyes wide and fearful, whispering that the man had moved closer, that he was watching her sleep. I tried to calm her down, telling her that no one was there, that it was all just in her mind. But as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was in the room with us. By 11 p.m., most of the patients had fallen asleep. The hospital became deathly quiet, the kind of silence that makes every creak and groan of the building sound amplified. Lena had finally drifted off, so I took the opportunity to stock up on supplies in the linen room, trying to keep myself busy. That's when I heard it. A noise, soft, almost imperceptible, coming from behind me. The linen room was small, the door closed tightly behind me. I froze, listening. Nothing. I shook it off, assuming it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then I felt something unmistakable. A hand, a cold, heavy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I stared at the door, half expecting someone to be standing on the other side, but it remained shut. I stepped into the hallway, glancing around, hoping to catch sight of a fellow nurse or maybe even a patient who had wandered out of their room. But the hallway was deserted. I went back into the linen room, my hands shaking as I tried to finish stocking the cart. The unease was growing in my chest, and I wanted nothing more than to be done with my shift. I turned to leave, but as I faced the door, I saw him. A man, dressed in black, staring at me through the small window in the door, smiling. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor as a scream tore from my throat. The man didn't move, didn't react. He just stood there, grinning at me through the glass. I must have screamed louder than I realized, because the next thing I knew, a fellow nurse rushed into the room, pulling me up from the floor. I was shaking, barely able to form coherent words. I pointed to the door, trying to explain what I had seen, but the man was gone. Vanished. My colleague looked at me, confused. "What man?" she asked, glancing around. "There's no one here." I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. But she didn't believe me. She said the ward was quiet and no one had been wandering around. I insisted that there was a man in black, watching us through the window. But no matter how much I protested, there was no sign of him. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Lena woke up screaming about the voices again, this time more frantic than before. She begged me to take her away, said the man was coming for her. I asked her what he looked like, if he was smiling. Her expression darkened, and she grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone so frail. "How did you know?" she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. How did you know he was smiling? That was the last straw for me. I requested to be transferred to a different ward for the remainder of the night, unable to shake the eerie feeling that lingered in my mind. The next day, I sent a message to the head nurse telling her that I couldn't do it anymore, that my next shift would be my last. I've never been diagnosed with anything. I've never hallucinated before. I understand the effects of sleep deprivation, but this wasn't a hallucination. I know what I saw. The man in black, smiling through the glass, was real. The help desk. I'd been looking for work for months and nothing was sticking. I was desperate. My savings were gone and bills were piling up. That's why I didn't ask too many questions when I got an email from a company I'd never heard of, OmniAssist Solutions. Customer support representative needed, no experience necessary, paid training. Sounded perfect. I'd done call center work before, mostly answering phones for insurance companies or handling customer complaints for cable providers, but the pay was never this good. I didn't recognize the name OmniAssist, but I wasn't about to turn down the opportunity. I applied on the spot, and by the next morning I had a response waiting for me. "You've been selected. Please report to OmniAssist's main office for your first shift tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp." No interview, no onboarding, just a quick response telling me I'd been hired. Maybe that should have been my first red flag, but I ignored it. I needed the job. The office was in a weird part of town, one of those new corporate developments that seemed to pop up overnight, glassy and sterile, wedged between warehouses and half-built condos. OmniAssist was housed in a featureless gray building with tinted windows that looked like a corporate bunker. There was no signage outside, just the address on the door, 1313 Myers Parkway. I arrived early, walking through the automatic doors into a blindingly bright lobby. The floors were white tile, the walls pure glass. It was like stepping into the future, but the kind you don't want to live in. There was no receptionist, no security guard, just a touchscreen kiosk in the middle of the room with a message flashing on the screen. "Please enter your name." I typed in my name and waited. The screen blinked for a moment, then the message changed. "Proceed to the elevator. Floor 6. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, almost too perfectly timed. as though they had been waiting for me. I hesitated for just a second before stepping inside. The 6th floor was unnervingly quiet. The elevator opened into a large open office space, but there were no cubicles or desks, just rows of workstations, each with a chair and a headset. There were about a dozen other people there already, all seated at their stations, staring blankly at their monitors. No one looked up when I entered. I stood there awkwardly for a moment, wondering where I was supposed to go, when a voice spoke from behind me. I turned to see a woman standing at the edge of the room. She was dressed in a gray suit, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was pale, almost expressionless, like she hadn't smiled in a long time. "I'm Julia, your supervisor," she said. "Follow me." I nodded and followed her through the rows of workstations, the soft hum of electronics buzzing all around me. Julia led me to an empty station near the back of the room and gestured for me to sit. "This is your workstation. You'll be handling customer support requests through our system. It's all automated, so you won't have to do much. Just follow the prompts. If you have any questions, I'll be nearby." She didn't wait for me to ask any questions, just turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly on the tile floor. I sat down, feeling a bit disoriented, and put on the headset. The screen in front of me flickered to life, displaying a simple message. "Welcome, Alex. Begin your shift now." At first, the job seemed easy, almost too easy. The system was automated, just like Julia had said. The calls came in, but I didn't have to speak to anyone directly. Everything was handled through preset scripts. A customer would ask a question or report an issue, and I'd click a button to select the appropriate response. Most of the requests were simple: password resets, account updates, shipping questions. Every call was handled in less than 30 seconds. It was mindless, mechanical, but I didn't mind. I wasn't there to think, I was there to get paid. The only strange thing was that I never actually heard the customers. The headset stayed silent. The requests just appeared as text on the screen, like I was handling emails instead of calls. But then, halfway through my shift, something changed. I was working through another round of requests when the screen glitched. Just for a second, it flashed white, and then a new message appeared. "Customer request. Help me." I blinked, staring at the screen. The request had come in like all the others, but this one was different. There were no details, no account information, just those two words. "Help me." I hesitated for a second before clicking the response prompt. The system automatically selected a generic response. "Please clarify your issue so we can assist you." I hit send and waited. Nothing happened for a minute, and I thought maybe it had been a glitch. But then the screen flickered again. "Customer request, help me." I tried responding again, but the system wouldn't let me. The button to send the response was grayed out. I stared at the screen, feeling an odd tension creeping up my spine. A few minutes later, another request appeared. This time the words were different. "You can't help me." I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure if this was some kind of test or if the system was malfunctioning, but either way, it was starting to freak me out. I glanced around the office, but none of the other workers seemed to notice anything strange. They were all still hunched over their monitors, their fingers tapping away methodically. I was about to take off my headset and ask Julia what was going on when the screen flickered again. This time, it wasn't a customer request. It was a photo. The image was grainy, black and white, but I could make out a figure. It was a man, sitting at a workstation like mine, staring at his monitor. He looked tired, his face gaunt and his posture slouched. Before I could react, the image changed. Another photo. This one showed the same man, but he looked worse. His eyes sunken, his skin pale, like he hadn't slept in days. The screen flickered again and the final photo appeared. My stomach lurched. The man was gone, replaced by an empty chair. I ripped the headset off, my hands trembling. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. I stood up looking around the room, but no one else seemed to notice. Everyone else was still working, their eyes locked on their screens, oblivious to what was happening. I made my way to Julia's desk, my heart racing. "Something's wrong with the system," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just got a message. And then these photos." Julia didn't look up. She just kept typing. I reached out to tap her on the shoulder, but when my hand brushed her arm, I recoiled. Her skin was cold. Too cold. "Julia," I whispered, my voice shaking. Slowly, she turned to face me, and for the first time I noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the unnatural stillness of her movements. Her face was expressionless, like she hadn't blinked in hours. "You need to return to your station," she said, her voice flat, almost robotic. "You're not authorized to leave during your shift." I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. Something was very wrong here. I hurried back to my workstation, grabbed my bag, and made for the elevator. I pressed the button, but the doors didn't open. I hit it again, harder this time, but nothing happened. The screen behind me flickered. I turned slowly, my stomach dropping as I saw the message, "You can't leave." I felt the walls closing in on me, the air growing thick and heavy. My chest tightened as I looked around the office, realizing something terrifying. None of the other workers had moved. Not since I'd arrived. I sprinted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty building. When I finally burst through the front doors and into the cold night air, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as I ran to my car, I glanced back at the building. Through the glass doors, I could see Julia still sitting at her desk, staring straight ahead, watching. The warehouse shift. I was never the type of guy to turn down a job, especially when I needed the money. Rent was coming up and my savings were dangerously low, so when I got a call from Crestfield Warehousing saying they had an immediate opening for a night shift worker, I jumped on it. It wasn't glamorous. Loading boxes, cleaning, a bit of heavy lifting, but it paid better than most gigs I'd seen around town. The warehouse was on the outskirts of Fresno, in one of those industrial areas where everything looks the same. Rows of gray, windowless buildings with faded signs and empty parking lots. I pulled in around 10:30 p.m. just in time for my first shift and parked under a flickering streetlight. The place was huge, but eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of machinery in the distance. I checked my phone, no service of course, typical for places like this. The front door was one of those big metal ones that rattles when you push it. Inside, the smell of dust and old cardboard hit me immediately. The lights overhead buzzed with that dull, fluorescent hum, casting a pale yellow glow over everything. Rows and rows of stacked boxes stretched out as far as I could see. A man in his mid-40s, Tim, greeted me at the front desk. He was the night shift manager, with graying hair, a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, and a look that screamed, "I've seen some things." He had that weary, seen-it-all vibe, like he'd been working in places like this for decades. "Alex, right?" he said, barely glancing up from a clipboard. "You're the new guy?" "Yeah, that's me," I said, trying to sound confident. I didn't want to come off as a total rookie, even though this was my first warehouse job. "Good. We've been short-staffed lately. You'll be doing basic stuff, moving boxes, organizing shelves, maybe some cleanup. Night shift's pretty quiet, though." He gave me a quick once-over. "You ever worked nights before?" I shook my head. "No, but I'm used to late hours." "Good," Tim muttered. "Not a lot of people can handle the quiet out here." He handed me a pair of gloves, an ID badge, and a walkie-talkie. "You won't need this much, but just in case." Tim walked me through the warehouse, giving me the rundown on what I'd be doing. The place was massive, long aisles of boxes, stacked up to the ceiling, with forklifts parked along the walls. Some of the shelves looked like they hadn't been touched in years, thick layers of dust covering everything. As we walked, the sound of our footsteps echoed weirdly, like the building was swallowing the noise. "You'll mostly be working in this section," Tim said, gesturing to a row of shelves near the back of the building. "These boxes haven't been moved in a while, so you'll need to reorganize them. Just make sure everything's stacked properly. Last thing we need is a box falling on someone's head." I nodded, trying to keep track of where everything was. It wasn't hard, but there was something about the size of the place that made me uneasy. The lights overhead didn't reach all the corners, leaving long, dark shadows stretching across the floor. "Oh, and one last thing," Tim added as we reached the back of the warehouse. "The cameras in the back section here don't work. We've had some electrical issues back there, so if you need anything, just use the walkie." I gave him a nod, but something about the way he said it felt off. Maybe I was just overthinking it. By 11 p.m., I was alone in the back section, stacking boxes like I'd been shown. The radio played faintly from an old speaker mounted on the wall, some classic rock station that cut in and out with static every few minutes. I was trying to focus, getting into a rhythm, but the warehouse felt too quiet, too still. Every now and then I'd hear a creak or a faint tapping sound, but I told myself it was just the building settling or maybe a rat scurrying around in the dark corners. Around midnight, I was halfway through moving a pallet when I heard it, a loud thud from somewhere behind me. I froze, my hand hovering over the next box. The sound was unmistakable, like something heavy had been dropped. I turned, scanning the dimly lit aisles, but there was nothing, just rows of boxes stretching into the darkness. I grabbed the walkie-talkie from my belt, feeling a little ridiculous, and pressed the button. "Hey, Tim, you copy?" His voice crackled through the static. "Yeah, what's up?" I heard something back here. Sounded like something fell. There was a pause. Then Tim's voice came through again, a little slower this time. "Could be a box shifted. Happens sometimes when the shelves get too full. Just be careful back there." "Yeah, okay," I muttered, clipping the walkie back onto my belt. I tried to shake off the weird feeling and went back to work, but I couldn't get the sound out of my head. It had been too loud for just a box shifting. About an hour later, things got weirder. I was stacking boxes near the far end of the aisle when I heard something again. But this time it wasn't a thud. It was a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, and it seemed to come from the other side of the shelving unit. I froze, straining to hear. The radio crackled, cutting out for a second, and then the voice came again, just barely audible over the static. "Alex!" My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a random sound. It had said my name. I stood there for a minute listening, but the voice didn't come back. I grabbed the walkie again, my hand shaking a little. "Tim, you still there?" "Yeah, what's going on?" "I swear I just heard someone calling my name back here." The line was quiet for a second before Tim responded. "There's no one else back there but you, Alex. Could be the radio picking up interference. Happens sometimes when the signal's bad." I didn't believe him. The voice hadn't come from the radio. It had come from inside the warehouse. But I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I muttered, "Yeah, must be," and went back to stacking boxes. The rest of the night dragged on, but the feeling that something was wrong never went away. Every creak, every distant sound made my skin crawl. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the end of the aisle, watching me from the shadows. At around 3 a.m., I was just finishing up when the lights flickered. It was brief, just a quick dimming of the overhead fluorescence, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. I stared up at the ceiling, waiting for them to flicker again, but everything stayed steady. I was about to keep working when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. I wasn't imagining it this time. I could hear them, clear as day, walking toward me from the dark section of the warehouse. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the walkie again. "Tim, I'm hearing something. Footsteps this time. Are you sure no one else is here?" There was a crackle of static, then Tim's voice, lower now, more serious. "You need to leave. Now." "What?" I stammered, my pulse racing. "What do you mean?" The walkie crackled again, but his response was drowned out by a loud metallic clang from behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing, just the rows of boxes, stretching on endlessly. "I'm coming back to the front," I said into the walkie, my voice shaking. But there was no response, just more static, I didn't wait. I grabbed my things and started moving, walking as fast as I could down the aisle, back toward the front of the warehouse. My footsteps echoed, too loud in the empty space, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. By the time I reached the front, I was practically running. Tim was waiting by the desk, his face pale. He didn't say anything as I walked in, just gave me a quick nod. "Go home, Alex. You did enough for tonight." I didn't argue. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, my heart still pounding in my chest. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized my hands were shaking. I never went back for the second shift. The night security gig. A few years ago, I took a job as a night security guard for a small construction site on the outskirts of Topeka, Kansas. The pay wasn't great, but I didn't have many options at the time, so I figured I'd give it a shot. The job was easy enough. Watch over the site overnight, make sure no one broke in to steal equipment, and lock up in the morning when the crew came back. The construction site wasn't very big, just a couple of unfinished buildings and piles of materials scattered around. The company was building a new shopping center, and my job was to watch over it during the night shifts. They gave me a portable trailer to sit in during my shifts, a few security cameras that I could monitor from inside, and a basic flashlight. Nothing high-tech, just a simple gig to earn some extra cash. My first shift started at 10 p.m., and when I arrived, the site was already deserted. The crew had packed up for the day, and there was nothing but quiet, empty space as far as I could see. The only light came from the floodlights positioned around the site and the small glow from the trailer. I stepped inside the trailer, which was equipped with a small desk, a couple of monitors showing the camera feeds, and a coffee pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. I sat down, pulled out my phone, and figured I'd pass the time by watching YouTube videos. Easy money, right? The first couple of hours were dead quiet. I kept an eye on the monitors, but there was nothing to see, just the empty site, the half-built walls, and the occasional breeze that stirred up some dust. I did a quick patrol around midnight, walking the perimeter with my flashlight, but again, nothing. Just me and the quiet. By 2 a.m., I was starting to feel the fatigue set in. I hadn't worked a night shift in a while, and staying awake in the dark, empty lot was harder than I'd expected. I made myself a cup of coffee, leaning back in my chair, trying to keep my eyes on the screens. That's when I noticed something. One of the camera feeds, a grainy shot of the far side of the lot, was showing a bit of movement. It wasn't anything major, just a flicker of motion in the corner of the screen. At first I thought it might be a stray animal, maybe a raccoon or a dog, but I couldn't tell for sure. I leaned in, squinting at the monitor, but whatever it was had disappeared before I could get a better look. I didn't think much of it at first. It was probably nothing, just a bit of wind or maybe a small critter passing through. But I figured it was my job to check it out, so I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold, and the site was eerily quiet as I made my way to the far side of the lot, where I'd seen the movement on the camera. I walked slowly, sweeping my flashlight back and forth, but I didn't see anything. No signs of an animal, no people, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, something felt off. I stood there for a minute, listening to the wind rustling through the unfinished walls, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. But after a few minutes, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. It was a quiet night, and I was probably overthinking it. I walked back to the trailer, making sure to check the other cameras as I passed. Everything seemed fine, so I settled back into my chair and tried to distract myself. Around 3:30 a.m., something strange happened. I was watching the camera feeds when I noticed one of the monitors glitch. It flickered for a second, cutting out and coming back on, but this time there was something on the screen that hadn't been there before. It was a figure, standing just outside the edge of one of the unfinished buildings, barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, leaning closer to the screen. The figure was tall, wearing what looked like a hoodie, but they were too far from the camera to make out any details. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, waiting for the figure to move, but they didn't. They just stood there, facing the building, not moving an inch. Now, I'm not the type to get scared easily, but something about seeing someone out there, standing so still in the middle of the night, set off alarm bells. Was it a trespasser? Maybe someone trying to steal equipment? I grabbed my flashlight again, feeling my pulse quicken. I wasn't excited to go out there, but it was my job. I stepped outside, walking toward the spot where I'd seen the figure on the screen. But when I got there, nothing. No one was around. Just the same empty construction site as before. I felt a little ridiculous at this point. Maybe the camera had glitched, or maybe I was just seeing things from being overtired. Either way, I did a quick patrol around the area and then headed back to the trailer, feeling frustrated and a bit spooked. I sat down, watching the camera feeds, waiting for something else to happen, but the figure never reappeared. At 6 a.m., the crew showed up to start their shift. I handed off the keys to the next guard and went home, figuring it was just a weird night. But the whole thing stuck with me. The figure on the camera, the feeling of being watched. A few days later, I worked another night shift. This time, nothing happened. No weird glitches, no figures on the camera. It was a normal, boring night, and I was glad for it. But before I left, I asked one of the workers if they'd ever seen anything strange on the site, just in passing, trying to sound casual. The guy shrugged. Sometimes we get people wandering through, homeless folks mostly. They don't usually stick around, though. I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time, but something about the figure on that screen didn't sit right with me. It wasn't someone just passing through. It felt intentional. I didn't stay at the job much longer. The pay wasn't worth the long hours, and I found something better a few weeks later. But every now and then, I think about that night and wonder if it was just a glitch, or if someone had been watching me. The Carved Curse. Growing up in a small town, Halloween was practically sacred. Every year, kids from all over would flock to Jacob's farm for the annual Pumpkin Patch Festival. Jacob, an old farmer with a perpetually grim expression, set up an elaborate display of scarecrows, hay bales, and pumpkins of all shapes and sizes. But what really set his farm apart was the legend of the Carved Curse. Everyone in town knew the story. Supposedly, if you carved a pumpkin from Jacob's patch on Halloween night and left it outside overnight, something bad would happen to you. Most people brushed it off as an old wives' tale, a harmless bit of fun to add to the Halloween spirit. But every year there were whispers about strange occurrences. People claiming to have seen shadowy figures in their windows, unexplained scratches on doors, or worse. Still, the warnings didn't stop people from picking out their pumpkins. This Halloween, my friend Mike and I decided to head over to Jacob's farm. We weren't superstitious, and honestly, we thought the Carved Curse was a gimmick to attract visitors. But when we got to the farm, there was something off about the place. The air felt colder, the scarecrows seemed more sinister, and Jacob himself barely acknowledged us as he handed us 2 pumpkins with a strange glint in his eye. We didn't think much of it and went back to Mike's place to carve them. We spent hours creating the most grotesque faces we could think of. Twisted mouths, jagged teeth, and hollow eyes. We laughed about the curse, daring each other to leave our pumpkins outside that night. Eventually, we agreed to test the legend, convinced it would amount to nothing more than a funny story to tell later. I left my pumpkin outside on Mike's porch, its twisted face staring into the street. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something strange. The street was empty, but the shadows seemed wrong. They were too long, stretching unnaturally as if trying to pull themselves closer to the house. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just getting into my own head. We went to bed a little after midnight, but around 3 a.m. I woke up to a strange noise coming from outside, like something scraping against the pavement. I brushed it off as a stray animal or the wind and tried to go back to sleep. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like something heavy was being dragged. Unable to ignore it any longer, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the window. The sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. My pumpkin was gone. In its place was a faint trail of dirt, leading away from the porch and down the road. I nudged Mike awake, barely able to contain my panic, and together, We followed the trail. The path led us down empty streets, past darkened houses, and toward the edge of town. The dirt trail ended at Jacob's farm. There in the middle of the field were dozens of pumpkins, all arranged in a perfect circle. But they weren't the same ones we'd seen earlier in the day. These pumpkins had faces, some familiar, others grotesque and twisted, each one staring out with hollow eyes and wide, unnatural grins. Then we saw them, our pumpkins, right in the center of the circle. They had moved on their own, or something had moved them. But the faces were different. The expressions we'd carved were now warped, twisted in fear. It was as if our own pumpkins were staring back at us, warning us to leave. Mike whispered, "Let's get out of here." But just as we turned to leave, we heard a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The air grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. I glanced back at the circle, and that's when I saw them. Shadowy figures began emerging from behind the pumpkins. Mike grabbed my arm, yanking me backward, and we bolted, stumbling through the field and back to the road. But no matter how fast we ran, I could feel them behind us, their presence a cold weight on my back. We didn't stop until we reached his house, slamming the door behind us and locking every possible entry. We barely slept that night, too shaken to close our eyes, fearing what we might see if we did. In the morning, I peeked outside. Our pumpkins were back on the porch, but they looked different. The grins were wider, the eyes deeper, almost mocking us. It was as if they were saying, "We'll be back." For days after, strange things happened. I found dirt on my doorstep, footprints that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Mike started hearing whispers outside his window, faint but insistent, like something was trying to lure him outside. We decided to confront Jacob, hoping he could shed some light on the situation. When we got to the farm, he was there, tending to his pumpkins with the same grim expression he always wore. "We know about the curse," I blurted out, desperate for answers. "We left our pumpkins out, and now things are happening." Jacob looked up, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You boys thought it was just a story, didn't you?" We nodded, embarrassed but terrified. He sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. "That curse isn't for show. It's a warning. Those pumpkins, they belong to something ancient, something that needs a face to walk in our world, even if just for a night." "What do you mean?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. Jacob's gaze hardened. "Next time, don't go messing with things you don't understand." He turned and walked away, leaving us in stunned silence. We went home, resolved to never touch a pumpkin from Jacob's farm again. But every Halloween since, strange things have happened. I see shadows at the edge of my vision, hear whispers when I'm alone. And sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of a twisted, grinning face in my window, my pumpkin, still watching, waiting for the chance to return. The costume that wasn't there. Halloween was always a big deal in our little town. Every October, the main street transformed into a creepy carnival, complete with haunted houses, costume contests, and dozens of decorated booths run by locals. I'd been going for years, always bringing my best costumes, hoping to win the elusive first-place trophy. But last year, something happened that has me wondering if I'll ever go back. The night started like any other Halloween. I dressed up as a plague doctor, complete with a long black cloak and a handmade mask. As I walked through the carnival, kids and adults alike pointed and whispered about the creepy doctor. I loved it. The atmosphere was electric, crisp autumn air, glowing jack-o'-lanterns, and the smell of caramel apples and popcorn. It was while walking past the haunted alley, a narrow corridor strung with fake spider webs and flickering purple lights, that I first saw him. He wore a costume similar to mine, but his cloak looked worn, tattered, like it had seen many years of use. His mask was different too, more bird-like and sinister, with feathers along the edges and red lenses over the eyes that gave him a chilling stare. He just stood there, completely still, as if waiting for something. I tried to brush it off as someone getting into character, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, not moving, just watching me. It was unnerving. Halloween was for jump scares and cheap thrills, but this felt different. There was an intensity to his gaze that sent a chill down my spine. As I continued through the crowd, I lost track of him for a while. But each time I entered a new area, the candy booth, the haunted hayride, the fortune teller's tent, I'd catch a glimpse of him standing at the edge of the crowd. He never moved, never interacted with anyone else. Just stood there, always facing me. I tried shaking off the feeling of being watched by heading to the House of Horrors, an old theater repurposed for Halloween with dim lights and eerie sound effects echoing through the halls. I hoped that stepping inside would put some distance between me and my masked twin. But no sooner had I taken a few steps into the darkened maze of horror movie scenes when I felt it, a faint presence, just a few feet behind me. I turned around, my pulse quickening. He was there again, this time close enough that I could see the glint of his red lenses in the dim light. "Nice costume," I said, trying to sound unfazed. He didn't respond, just stood there, his head tilted slightly as if studying me. I backed away, trying to lose him in the twists and turns of the maze. The air felt thicker the further I went, the walls closing in as eerie whispers floated through the speakers. Finally, I ducked into a small alcove, hoping he'd pass by without noticing me. I peeked out, holding my breath. Then, something strange happened. I saw him walk right by me, but instead of the stilted walk I'd expected from a Halloween character, he moved smoothly, like he was gliding. I'd seen actors and staff walking around all night, but none of them had that level of silent control. It was unnatural. I waited until he disappeared around a corner before making my way back to the exit. By then, I was sure he wasn't just another visitor. There was something wrong with him, something I couldn't explain. I needed to leave. But as I reached the theater doors, I saw him standing there, blocking my way. This time he was closer, close enough that I could hear his slow, deliberate breathing through the mask. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered, his voice low and distorted, like it was being played through an old radio. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I fumbled for an explanation. I'm just here for the festival." "No," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "You're in my domain now. The dark domain." I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I bolted through a side exit, running down the street and not stopping until I reached a well-lit part of town. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze, like he was right behind me watching. When I finally reached my house, I locked every door and window, drawing the blinds for good measure. My heart was still racing, and my hands trembled as I tried to calm myself. I told myself it was just an elaborate prank, someone taking Halloween a bit too seriously. But a part of me knew better. The next morning, I decided to go back to the carnival site, hoping to get some answers. I went to the booth run by the local historical society, where they often had old costumes on display. I figured if anyone knew who the mysterious plague doctor was, it would be them. But when I described the costume to the lady at the booth, she gave me a strange look. "We haven't used that costume in years. It was from an old exhibit, part of the town's history." "What do you mean, history?" I asked, my voice a whisper. She hesitated, looking over her shoulder before leaning in. "Back in the 1800s, there was a plague that swept through this area. A doctor came through town, dressed just like that. Black cloak, bird mask, everything. They say he never left. Some claim his spirit still roams during Halloween, looking for those who enter his domain uninvited." I felt a chill run down my spine. Could it really have been him? I wanted to believe it was just a story, something to scare tourists. But then she added, almost as an afterthought, "The weirdest part. People who encounter him say he only shows up to those dressed like him, as if he's seeking out someone to take his place." I left the booth, my mind spinning. It sounded absurd. but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth to her words. I dressed as a plague doctor to win a Halloween costume contest, but I'd ended up with something far more sinister. Now every Halloween I avoid the main street carnival. I still see people dressed in similar costumes wandering the town, but each time I spot one I wonder, could it be him? Could he still be looking for someone to replace him? Or worse, was he waiting for me to return? The house that hides. I've always had a fascination with the eerie and the unexplained, so when I heard about an abandoned house at the edge of town that locals swore was haunted, I couldn't resist. There were plenty of rumors, strange shadows, lights flickering at night, even whispers from empty rooms. But the most intriguing part, the house supposedly didn't appear to everyone. Some people could walk down that street 100 times and never see it. Only those meant to find it ever did. I couldn't let a story like that pass me by. Halloween night seemed like the perfect time for a visit. Armed with only my phone, I walked through the old neighborhood, the houses growing darker and more decrepit the closer I got. The streets were empty, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the chilly autumn wind. I started doubting the tales. Maybe it was just a myth, a local legend to keep kids entertained. But then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it. The house stood back from the road, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes and an ancient wrought iron fence. It was a tall, Victorian-style mansion, its paint chipped and windows clouded with years of dust. Despite its abandoned state, a faint light glowed in the upstairs window. My heart raced with excitement and fear. I'd found it. As I approached, the gate creaked open with an unsettling ease, like it was inviting me in. The yard was full of dead leaves, and I noticed with a shiver that there were no other sounds. No crickets, no rustling branches. Just an unsettling silence. The front door was slightly ajar, almost beckoning. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the cracked windows, and every step echoed in the silence. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and old furniture sat draped in sheets, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. I held my phone's flashlight in front of me, feeling more and more like an intruder. The first floor was quiet, too quiet. As I walked through what must have been the parlor, I felt the temperature drop sharply. My breath fogged in the air, and I shivered, pulling my jacket closer. That's when I heard it, a faint sound like whispering coming from upstairs. Common sense told me to turn around and leave, but curiosity pulled me forward. I climbed the creaky, spiraling staircase, each step louder than the last. The whispers grew clearer, although I couldn't make out any words. They had an oddly rhythmic quality, almost like chanting. My heart pounded as I reached the landing and turned toward the room with the glowing light. The door was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I nudged it open and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the whispers stopped the instant I entered. The only light in the room came from a flickering candle on a small table. Next to it was an old faded photograph in a wooden frame. I stepped closer, and my blood ran cold. The photo was of a group of people standing in front of the very house I was in. But what made my skin crawl was that one of the people in the photo looked exactly like me. Same hair, same build, even the same jacket I was wearing. The photo looked old, faded at the edges, like it had been taken decades ago. I stumbled back, my mind racing for explanations. Maybe it was just someone who looked like me, some trick of the mind. But as I stared at the picture, something changed. I could swear the figure's eyes were moving, tracking me. I shook my head, telling myself I was just seeing things. But when I looked back at the photograph, there was no mistaking it. The eyes were definitely watching me. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out, grateful for the distraction. But when I glanced at the screen, a chill shot down my spine. My camera app had opened on its own, and a message flashed across the screen. Welcome home. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the house as I bolted down the stairs. But the front door, which had been ajar when I arrived, was now shut tight. I yanked on the handle, my heart pounding, but it wouldn't budge. Panicking, I looked around for another way out, and that's when I saw something that froze me in place. All around the room, covering the walls, were more photographs. Each one was of a different person, but they all had the same look of terror on their faces. And then I realized, with a sinking feeling, that they were all taken in this very house. In the corners of the photos, I noticed shadows, dark, twisted shapes that seemed to be reaching toward the people in the pictures. Desperate, I backed away, searching for any escape. That's when I heard a voice, barely a whisper, coming from right behind me.
You shouldn't have come here.
I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the empty house and those photographs staring back at me. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a photo of me. Standing there in the hall, my face pale with fear, as though someone had taken the picture just moments before. The chanting started again, louder now, and I could feel something closing in on me, an oppressive force that seemed to fill the air with a crushing weight. I bolted down the hallway, searching for any way out, and finally spotted a window near the back of the house. I didn't think twice. I hurled myself at it, smashing through the glass and landing hard on the ground outside. Dazed and bleeding, I stumbled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I was far from the house. When I finally looked back, it was gone. The entire house had disappeared, leaving nothing but an empty lot, as though it had never been there. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house or why it chose me. But every Halloween since, I've received a photograph in the mail. A photo of me, standing in front of the house that doesn't exist, with shadows creeping ever closer each year. Thank you for stepping into the dark domain. If these stories left you looking over your shoulder, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss what lurks in the next video. And remember, sometimes the shadows hold more than just darkness. Until next time, stay curious and stay cautious.